In the heart of a city that once stood as a symbol of black dreams, an old man, his eyes clouded with the dust of time, carrying nothing but a worn-out burlap sack, walked into a bank as if he were stepping back into his own past. They laughed, because no one believed him. No one thought that a man in tattered clothes could possibly own the very bank he just walked into. But then, he let the sack fall to the floor, and everyone from the manager to the tellers to the security guards held their breath, because what spilled out of that bag wasn't just bundles of old money or a weathered ledger with torn edges. It was the truth buried for more than half a century. If you've ever felt forgotten, pushed out of the story of your own life, then stay with this one, because this isn't just a story that will leave you speechless. It might just make you want to rise and reclaim something that should have never been taken, if you believe the truth deserves to be heard. Hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. What did this story awaken in you? Because this isn't just something to listen to. This is a return. And that old man, he didn't come to ask permission. He came to take back what was always his. Southgate, an old, worn-down neighborhood on the south side of Atlanta, where oak trees cast long shadows over cracked sidewalks, and stone steps still carry the breath of a not-so-distant time when black families lined up outside banks, clutching loan applications, chasing the dream of owning a piece of land to call their own. That afternoon, the sun poured hard across the broken pavement, so harsh it pinned every shadow flat against the ground. Freeman Rose Bank stood at the corner of Jefferson Street, a white stone building with mirrored windows that caught the sun like armor, a monument to success, power, and stability. The glass doors creaked open. An old man stepped inside. No one noticed. His long brown coat hung on him like a second skin, worn, faded. His cracked leather boots clicked across the marble floor. Slung across one shoulder was a burlap sack, thick, dusty, torn in places, tied shut with a frayed rope. His head stayed bowed, a fedora pulled low to hide most of his face. The people in the bank, customers, clerks, even the security guard gave him a glance and looked away. In a place like this, an old man with a sack wasn't much more than a flicker of suspicion. But he didn't walk to the teller, and he didn't take a seat. He walked straight to the center of the lobby where light from the skylight above poured down like a natural spotlight. He stopped, lifted his head, and then he spoke, not loud, not rushed, just enough for everyone to hear, calm, measured, like a man who'd waited his whole life to say these words. "I own this bank." Silence. Then a laugh from the teller window. A young woman whispered to her co-worker. An older man snorted. And the security guard, a big guy named Devin, started moving forward. Eyes locked on the sack. A manager emerged from an office at the back. The kind of man who adjusts his tie before opening any door. Marcus Vane sharp suit, fast walk, and a face trained to keep a permanent smile. "Sir," Marcus said, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is Freeman Rose Bank. If you need assistance, one of our staff." "I'm not mistaken," the old man interrupted, His voice didn't waver. "I came to reclaim what was stolen from me. I am Elijah Boone. I built this place." Devon narrowed his eyes. Marcus froze for a moment. A few heads began to turn. The old man said nothing else. Instead, he shifted his weight, unhooked the sack from his shoulder, and let it fall to the floor with a dull, heavy thud. No one laughed after that sound. He opened the sack, and what spilled out dragged the entire room into silence. Bundles of old bills, wrapped in leather cords, each stack stamped with the original Freeman and Rose logo, a symbol retired sometime in the 1960s. Then came a ledger, brown leather cover, cracked and brittle, its spine on the verge of splitting, but the pages inside still sharp, still legible. On the very first page, Elijah Boone. Marcus stepped forward. Cautiously, he held the ledger with both hands, flipping through its pages. His eyes stopped at the signature block. His hands began to tremble. "It can't be," he muttered. "This name, it matches the original archives at headquarters." Behind the counter, a female employee exhaled sharply. She looked toward the records room where black and white portraits of the bank's founders hung on the wall. In one of the faded photographs, a man in a suit, holding a blueprint, stood next to Jeremiah Rose. That man's face was the face of the old man standing before them. "I was part of this dream," Elijah said, "but they erased me from the story, pushed me out, and built all of this on a memory they twisted." No one laughed. No one moved. Customers were frozen. The bank employees stood in place. Devon, the guard whose hands had curled into fists, was now gripping his radio, but said nothing. Elijah took one slow step forward. His eyes swept the gleaming room, the high ceilings, the chandeliers, the marble floors, the polished nameplates in gold. "I am not a ghost," he said. "I am memory, and memory, when it returns, never comes back quietly." Marcus Vane still held the ledger in his hands, as if it were a piece of spine unearthed from another century, dug up under the burning sun of high noon. His fingers trembled slightly, his face drained of color, and each dry page made a sound like the past itself was groaning. Elijah Boone said nothing. He stood there, a monument, a piece of collective memory everyone knew once existed but never dared to look directly at. Every line in the ledger was handwritten. The ink, once black, had faded to brown, but the name was clear: co-founder Elijah C. Boone, 1952, stamped by the city of Atlanta, signed by the district commissioner. Below that initial capital contribution, $3,000 raised through personal cash and property. Marcus glanced up at the old man, then back down at the name. This wasn't just folklore. This was living proof, evidence buried deep in the machinery now rising up, raw and undeniable. You signed these," Marcus said, barely above a whisper, "but the bank's current records don't show your name. Everything after 1963 lists Jeremiah Rose as the sole founder." Elijah gave a half smile. There was no joy in it, only history. "Because since 1962, I haven't been allowed to step foot in this bank," he replied. "They erased me from the minutes, from the newsletters, from the memory of the community. Devon, the security guard, stepped back. He had never heard the name Elijah Boone in any bank orientation, never seen his face in the Hall of Honor. But now, standing before him, wasn't a myth but a man, with blood and breath and a past that had never been properly laid to rest. Jeremiah Rose and I were friends once, Elijah continued, his voice low, like wind at the bottom of a well. We grew up together, studied together, built this dream together. But then he traded the dream for prestige, and I traded my youth for a life forgotten. Marcus sank into a chair near the teller's counter, the ledger still tight in his hands. He flipped to a page containing notes from the bank's first board meetings, handwritten entries detailing conversations between Boone and Rose about the bank's future. One note stood out. Boone objects to opening First Midtown branch fears loss of community control. Right below it, a newer, messier scrawl. Jeremiah Rose proposes temporary suspension of Boone's voting rights to restructure bank under shareholder model. Marcus looked up. They cut you out by legalizing the betrayal, he said. Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward a space only he could see a place from his youth. A time when he believed the first black-owned bank would become a symbol of pride, not a scar. After they removed me from the board, I filed a lawsuit. The court refused to hear it. Lawyers called me too emotional. The press never mentioned my name, and when I disappeared, they said I died, but I didn't die. I was just erased by those who control the truth. A young bank employee, Layla, with cornrows and kind eyes, stepped quietly from behind the counter. She looked into the ledger, then back at Elijah. In silence, she walked to the nearest table, gently picked up one of the old money stacks from the floor, and placed it on the table as if laying an offering for a restless spirit. "I've seen a bill just like this in the archives," she whispered, "but no one ever taught us about you." Elijah smiled, not proud, not bitter, just a quiet recognition that memory had finally been touched. "Child," he said, "that's because they don't teach the parts of history they feel guilty about." The room fell silent. No one touched a keyboard. No one checked their phone. The whole bank seemed to stop breathing. The air no longer felt like a normal afternoon. It was heavy, thick with the weight of a past that had never been cleared away. "I didn't come back for money," Elijah said, his voice like wind through a narrow crack. "I came back for dignity, to remind you I never left. You just chose not to see me anymore." Marcus lowered the ledger and looked up. What filled his eyes was fear not of the old man, but of what he represented, a system that had unknowingly inherited a deliberate forgetting. The sun still streamed through the tall windows, falling onto the old paper pages, but that light no longer shone on the marble floor. It lit the shadow of a man, a ghost not fading, but finally taking form. The hallway behind the teller counter led to a room not everyone was allowed to enter. The Hall of Honor, where black and white portraits lined the walls, founders, presidents, and the faces considered the bedrock of Freeman and Rose Bank. Marcus Vane stood before those frames, hands clenched behind his back, A spotlight above cast each photo in a reverent glow like gods in some modern-day shrine. But the longer he stared, the more something felt wrong. In the center frame, Jeremiah Rose's three-piece suit, perfectly parted hair, that confident, polished smile. Beside him were other men, all proud, posed, but not a single one looked like Elijah Boone. Not one. He glanced at Elijah, who stood silently behind him, watching the images like a mourner peering into a funeral he was never invited to. "There's no photo of you," Marcus said quietly, voice heavy. "No name, not a single trace." Elijah nodded slowly. "I searched for my own face in this room 40 years ago." He said, "Every time I came back to look through that glass." Marcus turned to face him. How did they erase everything? Elijah's eyes lowered, not with sorrow, but with a coldness that belongs to someone who gave up hoping long ago. With power, with paperwork, and with the silence of those who believed staying neutral was harmless. He stepped forward, stopping in front of a frame titled "Groundbreaking Ceremony." First Branch, 1953. In the photo, a group of men stood on bare land, cement trucks in the background, and a wooden sign that read, "The financial future of the community starts here." Elijah pointed to a figure barely on the edge of the frame, just a shoulder, a hat, the face cropped out. "That was me," he said. "They couldn't tear me out of the photo, but they could crop me out of the story." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. All the years he'd worked at this bank training new staff, giving historical tours to college students, all of it had been based on an incomplete truth, a curated lie. "I didn't think you were alive," Marcus said. "Didn't think you had the strength to come back." "That's what they were betting on," Elijah replied, "that if I didn't die, then silence would die in my place in the minds of those who never knew to look for me." From behind a half-opened door, Layla stood quietly. She had heard most of what had been said. She didn't enter. She simply placed one hand on the wooden frame. There was something shifting in her eyes, not just shock, but the awakening of a belief that had been buried too long. Marcus moved to the office desk. He unlocked a drawer. Pulling out a folder marked for upper management only, he laid it open, flipping through pages, meeting minutes, ownership transfers, internal memos. Then he stopped at a pale yellow sheet, letter of resignation, Elijah Boone, 1962. "Is this your signature?" Marcus asked, sliding the paper toward him. Elijah glanced at it, then gave a short, bitter laugh. "No, I never wrote that letter. I never resigned. I was removed." Marcus slumped into the chair. "So, that means everything ownership. History was built on a lie that was legalized." Elijah didn't answer. He turned back toward the wall of framed portraits, his eyes scanning the faces, some he'd once known. Some had shaken his hand. Some had stayed silent when he vanished. "They didn't just bury my name," he said. "They buried a part of this bank's soul, and now that soul is knocking on the door." Silence followed, a silence too dense for explanations, too sacred for law, the kind of silence that must be faced or fled from. In the distance, A church bell rang, marking the hour. Elijah turned back to Marcus one last time, his voice low, steady like footsteps on old wood. "I didn't come to tear this bank down," he said. "I came to excavate the truth." Marcus stared at him like a man waking from a long sleep. He didn't know what came next. But one thing was clear from this moment forward. There was no going back. Marcus Vane stepped back into the main lobby of the bank. His face had lost its usual corporate polish. What remained was a pale shade of confusion, like a man who'd touched something sacred and now stood exposed in the very suit that once gave him authority. Customers had begun to trickle out, not out of impatience, but because they sensed it, something larger was unfolding, something that had nothing to do with withdrawals or deposits. Those who remained stood scattered across the space, their silence weighty, like a church after the doors have closed. Layla followed behind Marcus, keeping just enough distance so Elijah Boone wouldn't feel cornered, but close enough to show she stood with the truth. Devin, the security guard, no longer looked at Elijah as a threat. He looked at him like a man who had walked through hell just to say, "I'm still here." Elijah Boone stepped slowly up the wooden steps to the center dais. In the past, this platform had been used to announce new loan programs or to introduce branch leadership. Today, it had become an altar for exhuming history. "I once stood here," Elijah said, his fingers brushing the polished wood, "back in 1954, at the grand opening. Back then, we called this the first financial foothold of freedom for Black people in Atlanta." He paused, his eyes drifting toward the large front window, where the afternoon light had begun to glow, amber. "That day, I wore a gray suit, a red tie. Jeremiah Rose gave the opening speech. They applauded us, both of us." Layla turned to Marcus. "They never told us about him." She said, "I thought this bank was started by a kind white man who wanted to help." Elijah didn't react. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, pulling in a breath as if steadying himself for a sentence he'd held inside for over half a century. "They didn't need to say who I was," he replied, "as long as they made sure no one else ever knew." Marcus opened a small wooden box on the front desk. Inside were copies of the bank's founding certificates. One by one, he pulled them out, until he reached the first page, temporary ownership certificate, Jeremiah Rose. He handed the paper to Elijah. "Where's your name on any of these?" he asked. Elijah flipped the sheet over. There, faint in faded black ink, was a handwritten note. Co-ownership, E.C. Boone. Temporary transfer pending financial review. "I thought it was procedural," Elijah said. "I signed it in good faith. Rose said we'd switch it back in 6 months, but by the 4th, I was summoned to an emergency meeting, and just like that, I was gone." Marcus nodded, exhaling, and from that moment on, there was only one name, Rose. The air inside the lobby thickened, as if the building itself was trying to swallow the story it had buried for decades. The photos on the wall, the certificates, the old newspaper clippings, suddenly, they all meant something different, no longer just emblems of achievement, but artifacts of a deliberate erasure. A middle-aged customer, Mrs. Jackson, a retired schoolteacher, stepped forward, slowly approaching Elijah. "I used to teach my students that Freeman Rose was our community's dream. She said that it was proof Black people could rise, but I didn't know what we'd lost to get there." Elijah nodded gently. "You weren't wrong," he said. "The dream was real, but if we don't see who got pushed out of it, then we're living in a dream that forgot its people." Layla stepped up onto the dais, lifting one of the old bills from Elijah's sack. She held it high, so everyone could see the original seal, the old bank logo, and a faded inscription that read Equity Deposit Certificate, Freeman Rose Bank, 1952. Her voice was calm, not loud, but unmistakably clear. "We've been standing on a foundation built from denial." No one answered, but no one objected either, because once truth is recognized, it ceases to be optional. It becomes a responsibility. Elijah stood tall. The spine once bent by decades of silence now rose with quiet pride. He hadn't come for pity. He came so they would finally look him in the eye and say, "You were there, and you are still here." Word of the old man named Elijah Boone spread beyond the walls of Freeman Rose Bank, like a spark catching dry paper, not through the press, not by live stream, not even social media, but through whispers from one mouth to another, as if a living legend had returned to rewrite itself. That afternoon, a small group gathered quietly outside the bank. There were no signs, no chants, just silence. Eyes fixed on the building that once stood as a symbol of trust, and now as a question mark carved into stone. Inside, Marcus sat alone in the boardroom. Before him lay dozens of documents originals, copies, internal memos from the 60s, meeting minutes that had been quietly removed from public archives. All the things he once labeled irrelevant were now crashing together, a tidal wave of untold history. Elijah Boone sat across the table. He didn't speak, he just sat back, eyes closed, letting the silence speak for him, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a song only he could hear the melody of justice long forgotten. Marcus tapped the table. "We'll need to verify everything," he said. "I know you've kept a lot of records, and they look legitimate, but the board won't believe easily." Elijah opened his eyes and nodded slowly. "I don't need them to believe me right away," he said. "I just need to make it impossible for them to deny me." "It could take months, maybe even go to court," Marcus added, hesitating. "They might do everything they can to bury this again." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes burning now. "Son," he said, "when they buried my name, they didn't realize they were planting a seed, and one day that seed would rise and call itself by name." The words hung in the air, like truth suspended in time, and everyone in the room knew truth doesn't die. It just takes time to grow roots. A week later, an emergency meeting was held with legal representatives from the bank's headquarters, men in dark suits, leather briefcases, and voices cold as steel. Marcus presented everything: original deeds, state library confirmations, signature verification from the notary's office. Each trail pointed to one man, Elijah C., Boone as founder and first official shareholder of the bank. One of the lawyers, a silver-haired white man named Marshall Green, looked at Elijah and said, "Mr. Boone, if what you say is true, you were removed improperly, but that happened over 60 years ago. Under current law, ownership disputes beyond 30 years are considered void." Elijah chuckled softly, not angry, just tired of hearing it. "I didn't come for a deed," he replied. "I came to reclaim my name. History has no statute of limitations." No one responded, because no one could. Layla, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, raised her hand. She stepped forward, holding a photocopy of an old article, "New Bank for Black Residents Opens in Southgate," founded by Jeremiah Rose and Associate. She tapped the final line, "Associate unnamed." "He is the name that was never printed," she said. "We built an entire legacy on omission, and now that truth has returned, we still want to look away." Attorney Green turned to Marcus. "You're the branch manager. What's your view?" Marcus stood. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice no longer did. "I think, if we stay silent, then we're helping to bury the man who gave us life." He turned to Elijah. "I don't know where this leads, but from this moment on, I will say your name." Elijah said nothing, but his eyes gleamed with a light that hadn't been there for decades. Not the light of victory, but of something deeper recognition. Recognition in the very building that had once erased him. The story didn't end there, but something had become clear. When history finally speaks your name, everything false must shift to make room, even if it takes time. Even if the path is crooked, it will come. After the meeting, the boardroom sat hollow. The golden light from the ceiling had dimmed, as if even it understood the weight of what had just taken place. Elijah Boone remained seated. He didn't rush to leave. His hand slid gently across the polished wooden table, a table that had been replaced many times, but still rested on the same old marble floor beneath. He whispered, almost to himself, "Not every wound needs to be seen to be felt." Layla sat by the window, watching people pass along Jefferson Street. She thought about all the days she'd spent at the bank opening the teller booth, smiling politely, repeating scripts she'd been taught. Now everything felt different, not the work itself, but the awareness that made every old gesture feel like mimicry. "When did the truth become something we have to negotiate?" she asked, without turning around. Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked around the room, the wood-paneled walls, the plaques of recognition, the miniature bank models displayed behind glass. Each item was evidence of something built on his absence. Since the moment those in power realized silence was their greatest asset, he said, "As long as no one spoke my name, no one would ask why I wasn't in the room." Marcus entered, carrying 2 cups of steaming black coffee. He set one down in front of Elijah, then sat, quiet for a moment. "Before I started working here, I believed banks were places that held money and protected the future. But now I know some futures were forgotten the moment a signature dried." Elijah lifted the cup. His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze was steady. "You're not wrong," he said. "A bank is a place that holds value, but value isn't just money. It's dignity, it's effort, it's truth." He sipped slowly, his eyes drifting to the brass plaque on the wall, the one that listed all the past leaders of the bank. Every name was unfamiliar, none of them read Boone. Marcus followed his gaze, then quietly said, "I'm going to submit a proposal to add your name to the official records and to that wall." Elijah looked at him and was silent for a long moment. "Don't do it for me," he said. "Do it for the children growing up not knowing who made space for them to open a bank account, to buy a home, to dream." Layla turned. Her eyes misted. What about the people who knew the truth, but stayed quiet for decades? Elijah set the cup down. "Silence has many shapes. Some stay quiet out of fear, some for profit, some because they believe their voice won't change a thing." He looked at her now, his eyes softening. "But there's a silence that's more dangerous than all the rest, the kind that gets rewarded, the kind that earns promotions for not asking questions, applause for knowing when to smile." Marcus clenched his fists. In his mind, he saw the moments those strange documents he'd ignored, the meetings where Boone's name was dismissed as a minor footnote, the times he felt something was off, but kept walking because the path ahead was too easy. "I was part of that silence," he said. "You're not anymore," Elijah replied, "and that's where it begins." The next morning, when the bank reopened, something changed. Layla, a teller who once followed every step without question, printed a small sign and placed it right on the front counter. This bank was co-founded by Elijah C. Boone, 1952. No decoration, no logo, just the truth. And in a world where truth had once been punished, that small act was a revolution. Some customers looked at the sign and asked, "Who's that?" Layla smiled, "Someone they didn't want us to know, but now we won't forget." And then the unexpected happened. An elderly woman with silver hair stood in front of the sign for several minutes. When Layla asked if she needed assistance, the woman simply said, "No, you just helped me. I heard him speak at church once. Then he vanished until today. I thought I imagined him." Elijah wasn't there that day. He didn't need to be. Because now, his name had been spoken aloud, and in a world where memory was once buried, that was a resurrection. Elijah Boone no longer showed up at Freeman and Rose Bank every day, but somehow his presence had never been stronger. The small sign on the teller counter, co-founder Elijah C. Boone, 1952, was more than just a plaque. It was a newly reconnected artery, beating back into the heart of a community that had been misled. Each person who passed it read slowly and then asked themselves, "Why hadn't I heard this name before? Why were we never told?" And then, like a chain reaction, memory began to echo. A middle-aged man recalled how his father once did construction work for some Mr. Boone. An elderly woman shared that her great-grandmother had deposited her life savings into Elijah's bank because she trusted him more than she trusted the government. Fragments of memory scattered, half forgotten, began to align, forming a fuller picture. Elijah Boone was real. He had fought. He had been erased, but never vanished. One quiet weekend afternoon, Layla did something unusual. She stood in the center of the lobby, beneath the soft yellow light, and turned on the teller mic. "Today," she said, "the bank won't be sharing updates about interest rates or credit card offers. Today is about memory, about what was never taught." People stopped what they were doing. Customers filling out forms, employees behind the counter, even Devin, the security guard, removed his earpiece. Layla began to speak, not from a script, not from a press release, just the truth laid bare among the numbers and signatures. Elijah Boone had co-founded the bank. Elijah Boone had once dreamed of something greater, and Elijah Boone had everything taken from him only to return, not with rage, but with the quiet force of a man who never gave up. No one clapped, no one cheered, but the silence that followed was no longer the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of respect, of awakening. Marcus Vane, once a representative of inherited blindness, now stood between two worlds, the system he had served, and the truth he could no longer ignore. He began reworking the internal training program. This time, the orientation no longer began with board-approved history. It began with a video Elijah Boone, seated in an old wooden chair at the community center, sharing his dream. "I didn't build a bank just to hold money," Elijah said on camera. "I built it to hold trust, so a widowed mother could deposit her coins without being judged, so a young man just out of prison could come back and begin again." New employees sat and watched, and for the first time, they understood this was more than a workplace. They were standing in the middle of a legacy, and now they had to choose how to carry it forward. A month later, Marcus invited Elijah back to the bank, not to prove anything, but to attend a ceremony quiet but historic. A new wooden sign had been installed outside. Boone and Rose, Community Legacy Bank. When Marcus handed him the microphone, Elijah didn't speak right away. He stood before the sign, his hand trembling as he traced each letter, as if to make sure they wouldn't disappear again. "Thank you," he finally said, "not for giving me back my name, but for letting the dream live on." He looked into the distance toward the worn rooftops, the streets that had once known hunger but never lost pride. And then he finished with a single line. "This dream was never just mine. It belonged to everyone who was told they didn't deserve to be remembered. Today, we're not just reviving a name, we're reviving belief." That day, the wooden sign glowed under the late afternoon sun. And though Elijah Boone no longer walked quickly, no longer spoke loudly, he had lived long enough to see the truth etched into stone. Not through anger, not through violence, but through memory, through evidence, and through a dream that never agreed to die. June returned, bringing with it the familiar, sticky winds of Jefferson Street. But inside Boone and Rose Bank, the air had changed. Gone were the hurried footsteps of customers looking only to withdraw and leave. Gone were the lifeless training sessions, read word for word from corporate manuals. Now, there was something quietly living in the bricks, in the panes of glass, as if the past had finally found a home in the present, no longer exiled, no longer silent. Elijah Boone didn't come to the bank every day anymore. He lived in a small house on the south side of the city where he grew vegetables and read books beneath the shade of a magnolia tree. But sometimes he received letters from people he had never met. A young economics student wrote, "I want to start a credit union for Black communities, the way you once began." A single mother wrote, "My son asked me, 'Who is Mr. Boone?' And I told him, there was once a man whose name was buried, but who stood back up and claimed his dignity through truth." Elijah read every word. He kept each letter in a small wooden box next to his old ledger, and a few faded banknotes he still carried as reminders. One afternoon, Layla came to visit. She brought a gift, a wooden frame, holding a photo that had never been published, a complete image from the groundbreaking ceremony in 1953. In it, Elijah stood dead center, unclipped, uncropped. "I found it in the unscanned archives," Layla said. "I guess fate didn't finish the erasure." Elijah held the frame, his eyes misting, not because he hadn't seen himself young before, but because this was the first time in 70 years that no one had cut him out. At the bank, Marcus had rewritten the training curriculum. From now on, the very first sentence read, "History doesn't begin when someone tells it. It begins when someone lives through it." On the wall of the boardroom, a new brass plaque had been installed. Elijah C. Boone, 1919, co-founder, the forgotten, the returned. Nothing more was needed. Truth didn't require paragraphs, only permanence. On an early autumn morning, Marcus visited Elijah. They sat off the front porch, sipping tea as yellow leaves floated down onto the wooden steps. Marcus held a folder in his hands. "I've completed the application to submit to the State Finance Committee," he said. "They'll officially recognize you as the bank's co-founder, not just in our records, but on state documentation." Elijah didn't reply right away. He lifted his tea, took a breath, and set it down. "You know, Marcus," he said, "there are things I built that I never signed, meetings I led that were never recorded, people I helped who never spoke my name again." He looked out toward the dirt path that led to his garden, where lavender grew in soft, silent clusters. "And you know what I learned?" He smiled, a gentle, weathered smile, like the trunk of an old tree. "True legacy isn't signed in ink. It's etched into the memory of others by how you lived." Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. He understood. And for the first time in his life, he felt he was doing something not just right, but beautiful. When Elijah Boone passed away, the certification naming him as co-founder of the bank still hadn't been finalized. But at his funeral, held as the courtyard of the local community center, no one spoke of a forgotten name. They spoke of a father, a builder, a man who had walked through a century without ever letting go of the truth. Layla read the eulogy, and there was a moment that brought the entire gathering to silence. Elijah didn't live to become a legend. He lived to become a witness, and he left behind no will, only a reminder. Live your life so that when your story is told, Your name doesn't need to be written on paper, because it's already been engraved in the memories of those you inspired. That was Elijah Boone, a man whose name had once been erased, a man who never stopped walking, a man who left behind a legacy. Not signed in ink, but carried in memory. There are stories that don't need a climax to touch your heart. They just need truth, and someone patient enough to carry that truth their whole life. Elijah Boone didn't need a statue. He didn't need a day named after him. All he needed was a room where the truth could finally be called by its real name. And sometimes, that is the greatest victory a human being can have. If this story stirred something in you, if it brought back a memory of family, of community, of something that was once lost, share it with us. Tell us how it made you feel. Leave a comment below so that memory doesn't just come back, but gets heard. Don't forget to hit subscribe, turn on the bell, because every week, Tales of Black brings you stories you won't find in history books, but that live in our bones. Because Black people don't just carry legacy, we are the legacy. This is Tales of Black, where truth doesn't whisper, it returns, and it roars.